We'll be first beginning with a land acknowledgement. We'll have welcoming and opening remarks, and then we'll move into our community discussion on allyship and solidarity. And finally, we will have closing remarks. But before that, there will be a Q&A portion in which participants can ask of the panelists any questions that they may need clarification on. Okay. Oops. So no matter where we are, as we're gathered here today, we must remember that we're gathered on Indigenous land. I want us to take a moment to recognize the land and the original sovereign nations of this land that we're currently settled on. This land and its original nations have given us much, and we are grateful and humbled to live on this land. As marginalized communities, as racialized communities, as allies, we deeply understand and know the pain entrenched in this land, the pain of systemic racism and oppression that continues to adversely impact and disenfranchise Indigenous communities. However, gratitude and humility aren't enough, and we all have a collective role to play in creating an equitable and more just society. And it begins by continuing to engage in true acts of reconciliation. Truth and reconciliation must not simply be words, it is a call to collective action. So I wanted to take a moment and sit and think about our relationship with this land, with the first peoples of this land, Indigenous peoples of this land, and with each other, and how we're going to engage in this dialogue collectively together. Thank you. So now I'd like to invite our Director of the Anti-Racism and Cultural Diversity Office, Jody Lee Mitchell, to provide a welcome and opening remarks. So Jody, take it away.
Thank you, everyone. I am seeing over 800 persons gathered together to have such an important conversation. I am truly grateful for your activism. I'm grateful for your advocacy, and I'm just truly grateful for your presence and your wanting to increase your learning and the learning of your immediate communities on such an important topic of allyship and solidarity. And I've had many folks reach out to me one-on-one, just asking, how am I doing, checking in for support. Other folks that indicated, I can't sit here and watch the news any longer. I need to do something. I have other folks who came forward and said, Jody, what is your organization that you tend to contribute to? I want to put a donation in your names. And so I knew that there was an importance to continuously reflect on, think about, share tools and resources on how we can most effectively stand together in solidarity, in allyship, in a responsible way. And so I just wanted to share some of my reflections on this particular topic of allyship and solidarity, particularly as it relates to anti-racism work. And so the first thing that one needs to know is that engagement in anti-racism work is a lifelong journey that begins with deep introspection of one's core values, of who one wishes to be as a Torontonian and a global citizen, and the integral part race plays in that determination. In understanding our relationships with Indigenous peoples, in understanding our commitments and responsibilities to truth and reconciliation. Anti-racism work requires one to acknowledge that this work did not begin in 2020, or this work did not begin with this most recent movement. To be actively anti-racist means knowing the history of race and racism in this city and in this country, and the many organizations, organizers, and activists who have been mobilized in this work and providing support to communities for the past decades, including the work that is done around land rights, Indigenous rights, including work done as it related to the racist immigration laws that have existed, which is the root or part of the root of xenophobia and xenophobic comments and behaviors. The reasons that spark marches and protests may differ year over year, but the deep-rooted systemic racism that has always existed in Canada is the one constant that has not changed. One must actively determine their role and responsibilities as it relates to the impacts of colonialism and truth and reconciliation as mentioned. You must identify the spaces of power that you hold through your socially constructed identities and from other power sources, including in your profession. It's important that you use your power actively and responsibly to create spaces of opportunity and eliminate barriers for Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities, whether in employment, education, housing, healthcare, the criminal justice system, within the media. Whether you are using your voice, your monies, your real estate, your decision-making authority, whatever tools you have at your disposal, use them. Do not engage in this work with a sweeping brush. Racism is a disease that is impacting Indigenous and racialized communities differently. So whether it's in regards to policing, the education system, or in healthcare, the data continuously shows the differential impacts on Black and Indigenous communities in these varying systems. COVID-19 and our past interaction with SARS has also demonstrated the Asian community's unique experiences with racism, particularly through xenophobic comments and behavior. So understanding that this work truly requires to hear the individuality in the experiences of varying communities and even within those communities. Be brave and do more. Putting up a social media post is simply not enough, not anymore. Activate courage in your workplaces, in the classroom, and at your homes when you know you are hearing something that is just not right. What we need interrupters. Interruptions for the daily cuts that are created by subtle discriminations, microaggressions. We need change makers who are willing to take a look at the makeup of their teams, or willing to take a look at the images that are hung in their hallways, in their schools, and say we need to make a change to ensure the environment is reflective and, more importantly, welcoming to Black, Indigenous, and racialized persons. And in light of most recent times, as we focus squarely on anti-Black racism particularly, supporting the Black community, from my reflection, means understanding that the Black community is a community filled with a diversity of ethnicities, sexual and gender identities, creed and spiritual beliefs, different abilities, and many more individualities. One voice cannot represent the perspective of all communities, but yet you must know that every voice is touched by anti-Black racism. Supporting the Black community begins with relationship building. Actions only translate into support when trust is present. And let me say that again. I'm going to repeat it for the folks in the back. Actions only translate into support when trust is present. And for trust to be present, it begins with ongoing engagement, dialogue, and relationships with Black community members. So this notion of, by the very act of reaching out, means that the individual should now come and fold themselves into your arms is inaccurate. Establish the relationship so that we can trust the authenticity of this interaction. And supporting the Black community means allowing oneself to be willing to be held accountable, managing your defensiveness, because that's a natural human trait, is to get defensive when being called out, and then taking the steps to do better. And so to end, I've had a number of folks share many resources that are available and that are being circulated both online and in social media. And there is a faculty member by the name of Stephanie Nixon, who I'm quite fond of, and the work that they do. And they had brought to my attention an organization by the name of Showing Up for Racial Justice, which is an organization dedicating to moving more white people into racial justice movements. And so Stephanie, if you are on this call, I just invite you to place any website link or any additional resources or information within the chat room so that folks can have access to this resource. I was made aware that there's an upcoming meeting. It's an international organization that has a chapter in Toronto, and there's an an upcoming meeting this Thursday. And so I did want to create space in sharing that particular resource. So to the panelists, I want to thank you for sharing your own reflections, your own thoughts, experiences within this particular space. And for the 800 strong that's gathered here today, thank you so very much for creating the moment and spaces in having such an important conversation around exercising our allyship and solidarity responsibly. Thank you, everyone. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Jody, for those powerful and key reminders as we engage in this conversation around solidarity and allyship. Just before we move into our community discussion, I just want to reiterate, continuing in this collective spirit, that we ensure that we engage with one another appropriately while on this platform. So if there are any inappropriate comments that will be occurring in the chat, please note that we will be removing such individuals. Again, if by any means that the platform is interrupted and we are unable to control what's happening, we will ask, or Jody will ask, that everyone log off, and then we will reschedule the session for another time. So right now, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today's discussion on Let's Talk Solidarity and Allyship. I want to introduce Kathy Vimack, who is the Program Coordinator for the Sexual Gender Diversity Office here at UNC. T. Duke, who is the Assistant Director for the Indigenous Initiatives Office at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. And Ben Poynton, who's our Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Office, our officer, also at U of T. So just want to do a quick sort of roll call. Is Kathy, T, and Ben in the space? If you can turn your mics on, videos on.
Yep.
We can get started.
Hello.
Hi, Ben.
Hi, folks.
Hey, hi, Kathy. Hi, T. Okay. So thank you all for joining us here today as we sort of engage in this important discussion. Just a couple of reminders to panelists that as we move through the questions, there will be a 3-minute sort of time response. I may interrupt you, so get upset if you go over. So let's begin. So question 1, with the rise of social justice movements, both globally and particularly given the continued acts of violence towards Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities, there have been quite a number of conversations regarding the meaning of terms such as solidarity, ally, and allyship. In thinking about these terms in relation to social justice movements, how are these terms defined? So we'll start there. And I would like to ask T to start us off.
Minugajeb, everyone. Tiduk Ishnakaz, Anishinaabe Kwen Dao, Bijune Dodam. I just wanted to say good morning to everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time and being here and having this really important discussion with us. I'm a very proud Anishinaabe Kwe woman. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm from Treaty 3 territory, now residing in Treaty 13. So miigwech, everyone. In thinking about these terms, it's really interesting because there is also a lot of complexities within some of these terms. And I just want to throw these terms out if I could. And I do want to acknowledge a person, a UTM alumni and guest speaker who came to UTM in February, Dr. Christopher Taylor. And he doesn't know it, but he really changed my whole way of thinking about these terms, solidarity, ally, and allyship, and actually introduced a complete new term to myself and many of the other participants that attended during that day back in February. And Dr. Christopher Taylor shared with us that these terms we could cross-compare, we could verse each term together, but he actually mentioned about this new term, and he called it being a racial conduit. And what Dr. Christopher Taylor was saying is a racial conduit is a person and not an ally or an accomplice. They understand that they and only they have the power to remove and or eliminate systemic racism. And just in the short moment of these introductions, both Nikki and Jody have already said very specific terms that used when we're thinking about these. And I think the key term is power, that person and that, and more important, in addition to being a racial conduit.
T, forgive me, I'm going to interrupt you. I just muted everyone, so just unmute your microphone one more time. Yeah, we're getting some feedback.
Okay, thanks, Jody.
Thank you.
And in addition to being a racial conduit, a person that is identifying themselves as a racial conduit, they know when to remove themselves as well for racialized folks and Indigenous folks in order to support and help those communities be self-determined. So these are just some of the things that I'm thinking about in terms of some of these things that we're talking about around solidarity, ally, and allyship. I would toss them aside and connect with Dr. Christopher Taylor's new term of being a racial conduit. So miigwech for that.
Thank you, T, for sharing that. And then I'm going to pose this question to Kathy next. So when we're thinking about these terms, how are you defining these terms around solidarity, ally, and allyship in relation to social justice movements?
Thank you. I'm going to start timing myself, actually. Thank you, Jody, and thank you, T, for everything that you've shared. I'm going to build off of that a little bit. I think in terms of thinking about what allyship and solidarity means, I think it depends on who you ask. We see there are definitely, you can look up the more formal definitions of these terms, but I always think that words are important insofar as they're important for the people who use them. And these things are constantly changing, and they have particular histories that are, like Jody said, important to trace back to understand the history of racial injustice and also the movements that come out of that. At its very best, though, I think at its most meaningful, I should say, allyship, I think, refers to a lifelong process of building relationships. And this is what Jody's also mentioned. So really just to second that strongly, allyship is a lifelong process of building relationships. Solidarity, I think, for me, it points towards a unity, which does not mean sameness or similarity necessarily. I think it means shared interest in committing to community and being together. And I think for you folks, just a few slides ago, you highlighted the importance of thinking about the chain link as a symbol of unity, human relations, reminder to contribute to the community. Unity lies in strength. I think that's what solidarity points towards. And I think both of these things are important for our movements, both of these words and the connotations that go along with them. I think allyship speaks to something very clearly personal, speaks to a personal nature of practicing solidarity, and one that is deeply bound up in your own personal healing, your own unlearning, and your insecurities and your guilt. And I think that that's why the word ally is something that can still be relevant, because those pieces are still there, and they exist because we are individuals coming to these movements as individuals and then hoping to find togetherness there. And so I think that we can utilize both of them in ways that are strategic and recognize when one has to be at the front of something. I see folks have been sharing some links to Surge, and I think that some of the reasons why those communities are so important as well is that you get to unpack some of what allyship is and think strategically and critically about what it means to be an ally, to be coming at this with the history that you have come from, and I think that that's deeply personal. So I think weighing both of those things is important, but solidarity, I think, speaks to our connectedness, and that's a good thing to focus on, to take away from the you, because I think we can also get lost in the you of it a lot. And I think I know you folks have a question about this later on, but going further into the individual, the personal, can also lead us to a place where we can get tricked into performativity. And with the internet, that can be really tricky. So I think that's my answer for this, that both are useful, but thinking about them critically is the most important.
Thank you, Kathy. And then finally, we're going to move on to Ben in terms of adding to the conversation. What do these terms mean in relation to social justice movements, and how are we or yourself defining them?
Thank you very much. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I just wanted to begin by stating how humbled and honored I am and surprised to have been asked to participate in this panel. I just want to quickly censor myself as a white, cisgender, heterosexual man, a settler on this land and able-bodied with history of invisible disability. I use pronouns he, him. I just want to start by acknowledging I have a lot to learn in this space. I need to continue to commit to this work of supporting and holding up oppressed voices. I recognize I'm here by virtue of a power role that I have within the university as an AOD officer, but I want to speak to you today, as Ben pointed, and I can only speak from my experience as a white person, and I think it's time for us to start speaking authentically about our experience. I also want to acknowledge that there's some colleagues at the university who've been doing some great work in the area of white privilege and interrogating what this means for us. So they are Trish Starling at Harthouse and Brian Cunha. I've learned a huge amount from them, and I want to thank them for their important work and their advice to me in preparation for this session. I don't think I'm here to sort of try to suggest best practices. I think we can sort of get trapped in trying to say what's best, what's perfect. And I think some of the things I also learned from Kathy is that we can't always be perfect, and there's not one notion of how this works, but I think we do have to be careful around how we think about social justice movements. I sort of thought about this in terms of what social justice movements are. I'm not necessarily an expert in them, but I've become familiar with the term of the difference between social emancipation and social regulation. I think oftentimes we can get trapped in the idea that once a social regulation has been passed, and I use the AOD as an example of this, but I think it's helpful for thinking about how social justice movements work, and then the end goals of them and what we need to do to make sure that they don't sort of end. And so in terms of the AODA, what happened is a group of social justice activists asked for new laws, or asked for there to be some way in which the government could respond to having more freedom or addressing systemic barriers to oppression for that group. And so oftentimes what happens is governments respond with new laws and new ways of addressing the issues through laws. And I think that leads to new social regulation. And what happens is the impetus of the social justice movement gets transferred onto the new law. And I've heard many times, and I think we've heard this many times with respect to new laws, is that so we have the AODA now, or we have civil rights movements, or we have Indigenous rights laws. Isn't it finished now? Or are we sort of done? And I think that necessitates us to start thinking about the fact that it's not done. And I think we know that there are limitations and problems with the social justice or social regulations that exist, because they're not doing what we hoped that they would do, and they're not addressing all the barriers that we intended they would address. So that gets us to start thinking about the fact that we're all implicated and we're all involved, and the work doesn't stop just because there's a new law on the books. We need to be continually engaging this and see ourselves as parts of the issue and complicit in what's going on. And I think we can see that with organisations like the Disability Justice Network of Ontario, that is seeking to find disability justice, but looking at it from an intersectional lens so that they try to incorporate anti-racist principles and others. So that's how I sort of thought about this in relation to social justice movements. And I think because of the fact that we're seeing the limitations of social regulation and laws, we need to start realizing that it's something in all of us that we all need to start addressing, and think about the different spaces, places, locations in which we reside, that we need to start doing this work more thoroughly.
Thank you for that, Ben. So in thinking through these terms, as some of us may know, these terms are very complex and they're very nuanced. So in thinking and expanding upon, what are some of the considerations that we need to account for when we're using these terms, when we're applying these terms to what's happening currently. And I want to begin with T. I know T, you just mentioned initially in your beginning around being a racial conduit. I don't know if you want to expand upon that for this particular question in and of itself. So I invite you back to respond.
Miigwech, Nikki. Yes, there's a few things that I want to mention. I do want to start off first by just sharing an anonymous quote that I came across during curriculum development, and I'm still searching for the person, the knowledge keeper that shared this. But from an Indigenous lens, Indigenous people are not a people without hope. We have overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles in our long and painful histories because our Creator has given us the tools necessary for survival. We must not be shy to use them. And what I would like to share in response to this, in connection, in response to this question is, and we are not shy. And by that, I think I would really encourage folks, individuals, to really consider, again, that self-reflection piece that's really connected to being a racial conduit, like specifically recognizing and also understanding their own power and ability, responsibility to eliminate racism, but also too, that really does take, and in connection with some of the things that Kathy was mentioning as well, is the absolute importance of establishing and building and fostering meaningful relationships with community. And I'm not just, of course, like I'm speaking to the Indigenous, but I'm speaking to many communities and beyond. Meaningful relationships are absolutely integral, especially when we talk about these movements. And in those relationships, it's also understanding that it's important to listen, and more importantly, to follow community. It's really important to also ensure that solidarity, if we were to kind of connect some of those terms above, that solidarity, it's not performative. And that really means that showing up to support the community with your presence alone should be the baseline and not necessarily the end game. So like there's many different things to consider, but I think also it's really important to recognize the power that you have in order to support communities lead, and know that we have the skills, that we have the knowledge, that we have the values and attitudes to continue this work. So it's really just understanding, I guess, space, place, and time. It's understanding roles and responsibilities given to a lot of this work. And also, one of the other final things that I want to say for this, Nikki, is also, it's just understanding that every single person has a role to play or a gift to share and bring to community as well. So I just think in this piece, it really does have to do a lot with self-reflection and really understanding those roles and responsibilities and contributing and taking and supporting the lead from community. Miigwech.
Thank you, T, for that. And Kathy, if there's anything that you want to add around, what are some of the considerations when we're thinking about these terms or using them currently?
Thank you so much, T. I think I just wrote down something that T said, which is so concise, and it's important to listen and follow community. And I think that just reminds us that, like, this isn't, like Jody was saying, this has been ongoing. This is ongoing. We're a part of a bigger thing, a bigger story. Understanding that and being humble in approaching that, I think, is really important. For me, considering the connotations of the terms that we use when we speak about practicing solidarity or our allyship, considering the connotations will help you understand their limitations in terms of, like what I said earlier about in what ways can the word ally be limiting. I think we can actually anticipate some of the issues that come out of that when we understand its personal nature, which is brilliant and an important thing, because we all are individuals and we're people who are coming to this, and we're imperfect people, and we shouldn't be perfect people. But it is, it can bring us to a place where it's easily performative. So being self-reflecting on that, like T said, is important. I think a phrase that I also think about a lot from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, reconciliation as a relationship. It really is that simple, but it is also that complex, and because it is a process, it is a lifelong process and a commitment to being with folks, not just in times of crises, but in building our communities together and finding solidarity with one another at all times. And I think that also will highlight for us, like, the things that, you know, we shouldn't always be surprised by things that different communities are going through, communities that maybe our identities don't fully line up with personally, because those things are ongoing, but maybe we're surprised by them because we weren't around before the crisis.
Thank you, Kathy. And Ben, final thoughts on this?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much to T and Kathy. I feel very fortunate and humbled again to be on the panel with two such esteemed folks, and I think they've really given us some amazing things to think about. I think in relation to the nuances, again, I think I'm hearing a lot in the way that I'm thinking about what T and Kathy are telling me in terms of the sort of trying to bring us together and trying to have those interrelationships amongst the different groups, but also being mindful, especially myself as a white person, what I'm bringing into that space and what I represent and what people who look like me have done, and sort of acknowledging that in those kinds of spaces and being aware of my own self and how that can affect the situation, and making myself realize that I need to think more clearly about when I need to speak up, when I need to be quiet, when I need to make suggestions, and when I need to just listen. I think it's important when we sort of make the realization that we're all implicated in this and we all have work to do. I think it's important because we need to think about, it has a significant impact on how those of us who wish to support and raise up oppressed voices engage. I think it means we need to be mindful about the spaces, places, and locations where we are making the change, who we are speaking to, and what we're asking for. How often we engage in this work, that's a key thing that keeps coming up, and the key thing I'm going to try to remind myself of more often is how often this can't be something that just happens now. We're here because of some horrible things that have happened both in Canada and America, and have continued to happen for years, but there seems to be, we're at a tipping point, I think. But I think we need to continue to do this work and be honest and self-critical about the ways in which we need to change and the self-work we need to do. And this needs to be a change in all of us, because simply having laws on the books, as I mentioned before, isn't enough. I just have sort of 3 pieces of advice that I follow and will continue to try to follow more frequently. Is to check ourselves as white folks. A lot of us are new to this and will never have a lived experiences of the communities that have been oppressed. We need to be mindful of what we bring into the space. Jody had mentioned that there's been lots of stuff being shared, and I saw something by somebody called Tatiana Mack, which was around committing. So there's a lot to learn. I think to Kathy's point around we shouldn't be surprised by what we're seeing, but there's still a lot for us to learn. And we're not going to be able to learn it all right now. Unfortunately, I hope it doesn't happen, but the news cycle may move on, but the issues will remain. This is something I think we need to work on every day, and we need to commit by making sort of determined lists, learn to find the answers ourselves before asking people, take the time to look things up, read multiple sources. And I think the third thing is to think about what we can do in our own lives with the people in it. Have conversations with friends, family who don't normally consider these things, but we need to make sure that we're doing the work in our own way, in and amongst white folks, so that we can help to bring understanding to this.
Thank you, Ben. So we're going to move on to our second question. If you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. If you come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. So this is a quote by Lilia Watson, who is an Indigenous Australian activist, artist, and writer. So in thinking about allyship and what it means to be an ally, what tools or strategies are needed to be an effective ally? So some of you sort of touched on it in your previous responses, but if you, to expand on it for this one, I want to begin with Kathy with this one.
Thank you. I think in terms of what I always find interesting with this is when we start talking about equity, folks are at a loss about the things that they can bring to the table. It could, because it often when we're having these conversations, people sound a certain way when we talk about it. And then I think for a lot of folks, it's like trying to fit yourself into this image of what it means to talk about equity, what it means to have these conversations. And so just off the bat, I just want to say that we don't and we shouldn't sound alike. This is what diversity looks like. We have a variety of skills to offer, parts of our aspects of our personality that we have to bring to the movements, and to really embrace that diversity and be responsible and accountable for the things that we already have that we can offer folks. And this is off of what T was saying earlier as well, but like the strengths that you already have, what you're already offering to the world, will be the strengths that you bring to your practices of solidarity. And this can be very practically speaking skills. This can be money. This can be the way that you speak or can speak to this group or that group. I think figuring out all of those things are things that you're doing anyways. You are always leveraging your skills in your work, in your personal life. And so bring that and fit it into practices of solidarity, because you're not going to be a whole different person there. That's not the point. You're going to be who you are, and you have much to offer. And I think that I'm just looking at my notes here. Yeah, and thinking about what you have to share. That's the most important thing. And self-reflection, I think, is key here. Reflecting on the parts of social justice that are easier for you versus the parts that feel harder. And understanding that in those places you have space to learn, and you have room to grow. And I think that, like Ben was saying, learning is constant, because these movements are changing. The issues are morphing into things that look a little bit different but are very similar. And so following those things is constant learning, actually. And when I said we shouldn't be surprised all the time, I also mean, like, look at your media. Like, this is a very practical thing to do, but like going through your social media networks and figuring out the sources that I follow, do those things line up with my values? And if I'm constantly surprised by everything that's happening in the world for communities that I say I care a lot about, how is that reflected in the media that I receive? And nowadays we talk a lot about media and fake news and all of these things. There's a really big consideration, the kinds of propaganda that are continuing to happen. So protect yourselves from that. Think critically, unfollow and follow. Marginalized folks have always been speaking. Black and Indigenous folks are all over the internet sharing and teaching, and you just need to be critical and find those things.
Thank you for that, Kathy. And I'm gonna move on to T. So in thinking of allyship, what some of the tools, strategies you wanna share around that allies need to be an effective response when there are moments of social justice movements and lending support?
Maybe Nikki. Just briefly, even though there's like a lot of context that I could include, but within the Indigenous community, with some folks such as myself, I would always refer to what I know and what has been shared with me, given a non-Indigenous first ally, so to speak. And I know him as Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, or Dr. P.H. Bryce. P.H. Bryce is also an alumni of U of T. And what I learned in connection with being a part of and participating in a keynote speech with Cindy Blackstock, who is an Indigenous advocate for children and youth, specifically in the child protection system. And one of the things that Cindy has really shared with me in connection with P.H. Bryce is back in 1904, P.H. Bryce was hired by the Indian Affairs to be chief medical officer. And he completed research specifically on the medical conditions, the health conditions of residential schools in this time in 3 Western provinces over the span of 3 years, and around approximately 30 residential schools. And in that, when he completed his report in 1907, he ended up reporting to the federal government that there was approximately around 69% of Indigenous children that were dying from tuberculosis. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because Cindy Blackstock acknowledges P.H. Bryce as being one of our very first allies. Because when he shared that report back with the federal government and wanted to keep them accountable for some of the very horrific things that he was reporting and that were happening in residential schools, unfortunately, the federal government, they didn't praise him for this report and made changes to the system. They actually fired him and they buried the report. Now, with that being said, the thing about that I would really encourage folks, if we want to talk about tools and strategies to be an effective ally, it would really be to implement what P.H. Bryce stood for and what Cindy Blackstock calls moral courage. We're all born with moral courage, and we actually see it a little bit more in children in the most important years of our lives, between 0 and 6. So when you actually look, or if you're doing something wrong, morally wrong, and if you think about your own experiences, if you have kids, if you have nieces, nephews, etc., they call you out on it when something is wrong. Now, what happens over time, though, is we lose that connection to moral courage because we're actually able to weigh the options or the circumstances or the consequences. To the point of, for example, I don't want to step in because it's none of my business, or I don't want to do anything about it because someone else will do it and it's not my problem. And the list goes on. But what I would really encourage folks is to reconnect back with that moral courage and to also find ways to continue to be at the front lines with community. And I think about that allyship and that moral courage that P.H. Bryce really carried through. And even though he got fired, he eventually released, I believe it was between 1920 and 1922, he eventually released everything that he found in his research and widely shared it across the nation to really kind of wake people up to see, we have an issue here with this system, this assimilation policy and piece of legislation that the federal government is implementing on Indigenous children and youth and families. These are just, so if there's anything, and again, I just want to be mindful of time, but I do want to acknowledge the work that Cindy Blackstock does in terms of really educating community and beyond to understand on what allyship means, but more importantly, how can we role model our very first non-Indigenous ally, so to speak, P.H. Bryce, and kind of carry that through by implementing moral courage. So that's what I'd like to share on that, Miigwech.
Thank you, T, for sharing. And then finally, we're just going to move on to Ben.
Okay, thank you, Nikki, and thank you very much, Kathy and T, for that. I'm really going to take on the moral courage piece. I think that's really something key that I think I would like to move on forward with. I think in considering this question, I sort of looked at the quote and thought, I've been thinking a lot about this since it was sent, and I sort of think I could be wrong, but it seems arguable that if we all thought like this in terms of the quote about liberation being bound up, we might not be in this space, we might not be here, we might not be having to have these these conversations important though they absolutely are. I think that if this was something that was fully a part of us, I think we wouldn't necessarily have to be here. But I'm also struggling to figure out how white folks can engage in this and see their liberation bound up with racialized, Indigenous and Black folks' liberation without centering our own self-interest and how we might benefit. I think we have to, how can we remove ourselves from comfortable positions to act? To me, I think this plays into a broader point around the pedagogy of the oppressed, which is, I'm sure, a very well-known book by Paulo Freire, who mentions that how the oppressed-oppressed relationship can reinforce power imbalances, which is central to the idea of help and benevolence, which I think comes up in this particular quote. I think as white folks, we need to be aware of this dynamic and what role we play in it when we do seek to try to support or raise up different racialized groups. When I looked at this quote, I found a piece by the Indigenous Action Media talking about the idea of accomplices and allies. I know that T has already sort of proposed a different idea in terms of racial conduits, but I think what I took from that, and I think what we see in some of this, this quote, in some of the conversations we're having with this is there's an issue of self-proclaiming and confessional allies, those who seek to be performative. And I think those are some of the things we talked about earlier on in what's going on with a lot of the social media posting. And I think this can create the performativity and the piece that I read calls for us to consider being those accomplices or perhaps racial conduits instead, as I learned today, not allies. I think speaking to this point more broadly, I wanted to try to amplify 3 Black voices who I have read over the past few days, and I think they've provided me with some really key quotes and key ways in which I think we need to think about this in relation to the quote you mentioned. And I'm just going to read them out without qualifying, without adding my own thoughts, because I think that they just need to sort of land in this space. The first one is by Essie Edugian, who is a writer of Washington Black, a very well-known novel. And Maclean's asked her and other Black Canadians to talk about what they would say to Black Americans about what's going on here, because we know that there's this sort of weird going on about whataboutery in relation to what's going on in America. So she mentioned the weight of change shouldn't rest on the shoulders of Black people, and indeed it doesn't. For true systemic shifts to occur, everyone has to feel the disgust and frustration. Everyone has to recognize that the whole underlying structure is so irreparably broken that no one can afford to live like this anymore. The next person is Desmond Cole, who I'm sure hopefully we're all familiar. He said, "Every day our white majority wakes up to discover we are here, and by night they have forgotten us again. They say we are so few and that we need not be counted, so they don't know how many of us spend the day growing their vegetables, driving their cabs, and nursing their elders." And the final one is by Ibram X. Kendi, who mentions he posted on Instagram, and he had a picture, I think, of his daughter that he posted, and he put by a quote saying, "There have been many theories on what's fueling the growing demonstration against racism in public and in private. Let me offer another one. Love. We love. We know the lives of our loved ones, especially our Black loved ones, are endangered under the violence of racism. People ask me all the time, what fuels me? It is the same, love. Love of this little girl in the photo, love of all the little and big people who I want to live full lives in the fullness of their humanity, not barred by racist policies, not degraded by racist ideas, not terrorized by racist violence. Let us be anti-racist. Let us defend life. Let us defend their human rights to live and live fully because we love." I think that sort of gets to what that quote is trying to say. And I think that I am sort of qualifying a little bit, but I think it's helping to pull together a few different things that I'm thinking of, we need to start thinking about. And I think it goes back to a lot of the stuff that Kathy and T had said, was to practice empathy. I think we do that through reading, learning, listening to the histories and perspectives of racialized people in a way that does not place more emotional burden on these communities. One of the things Jonathan Hamilton Diobu said to me, who's a colleague and friend, about truth and reconciliation is we need to get to truth, because truth hasn't been told enough, and then that is hampering reconciliation. I think we're very lucky in the fact that there's lots of information out there. And I just want to also note that I think we're incredibly lucky to have Jodie, Nikki, and Simon here at the university for the past year. They've been doing amazing work with limited resources, and we need to continue to learn. We need to continue to support and raise up those offices in order to develop the rest of the community. And I think if you like what they're doing, if you want to see what they're doing sustained and grow, tell your departments, divisions, leaders, they need to be properly supported and resourced. I think another thing to do is to build or join networks who are trying to do this work as well. We've mentioned showing up for racial justice Toronto, and I think we need to continue to join those kinds of groups because we need people to hold us accountable. I think that's one of the key things that's not happening here. And I think it goes to the root of the quotas that we need to be thinking about this every day and finding groups that are going to help to make us accountable on a daily basis. And groups like that hopefully can help to do that. The final thing is I wanted to say is be mindful that we can't and shouldn't lead any of these, as a white folk, any of these organizations, and we need to be clear on our intentions. Once our solidarity maybe starts with us helping them or the other, we start to reinforce the power imbalance we're seeking to address. We shouldn't be in this for recognition or to be seen to be doing something. We need to know when to speak up and when to keep quiet.
Thank you, Ben, for that. And as we move into our final question, so in thinking about allyship, solidarity, and what it means to be an ally, we have multiple intersecting identities. So a race, our gender, our class, ability, and so on. So some of our identities we choose, while some may be forced upon us by larger societal constructs. So when considering and thinking about this notion of allyship and who defines themselves as an ally, should allyship be considered a form of identity? And I'm gonna start off with you, Kathy. That's it, let you finish, drink your water.
Thank you. Let's see. Should allyship be considered a form of identity? I don't think that's useful, to be honest. I think, and I was talking to Ben and T about this yesterday, but it makes me think of what I've read of Bell Hooks talking about the word feminist, in that she saying that like it's not a bad word, but it's just kind of unnecessary and it takes the focus away from what's actionable. Saying, is this person feminist? Are you feminist? Like, what do we mean by that? I think is a really great question. And I think that allyship is an important process, is a very personal thing. I think that that word can still be really meaningful. Considered as a form of identity though, I don't really think so, and I do think that it's important to say that the word ally is most meaningful when it is given, not claimed. Allies are friends, and I think it is a relationship that I think, you should hope that somebody can call you an ally, but whether or not like you take that to be your own word is less important, because what you can do instead is talk about the actions that you take, the ways in which your life is bound up in the lives of your friends and your communities and the communities that you are just a part of and building together. And I just want to share this quote here. I'm going to send it in the chat as well. But I think about this quote a lot, and it's a really popular one when thinking about this kind of work. But Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang saying decolonization is not a metaphor. Solidarity is uneasy, reserved, and unsettled matter that neither reconciles present grievances nor forecloses future conflict. And I think that those nuances are really important to keep in mind, and yet we don't need to see that as something that is not filled with hope as well. I think what that also says to me is that this is, there's a moving forward and we can do it together, but we're responsible to do that together. And just a couple other points, I guess. Yeah, it's working with communities meaningfully is really the key about all of this. There are no cutting corners there. There's no checklist. And I think for sometimes we feel a lot better about like getting a checklist, but it's so nuanced. These things are changing all the time. It depends on who is writing the checklist, that the checklist looks certain ways. And I think being critical about like why it is that we need that so badly is one thing. And not that there aren't best practices for moving forward, for connecting, but there's no cutting corners for relationships. It's time. I think it's important to also say that it's about tracing the money sometimes, often actually, all the time. Tracing the money to figure out, like Ben was talking about, the kinds of support that we can offer, and also like institutional support. And I think that's really important nowadays as folks are talking about defunding the police. There's a lived reality of why that's important, and also just socioeconomically, like we can figure out how we build, how this system is built, and money is going to be at the root of so much of that. And it's important that we demystify that. It's not surprising. It is what it is, and we do need to be really explicit about that.
Thank you. And T, I'm going to move on to you. And so, and just in terms of thinking about the question, should allyship be considered a form of identity?
Miigwech, Nikki. I don't want to sound too repetitive. I do strongly agree with Kathy. We did have, the three of us, we did have a good chat about this, and also like trying to kind of like bounce off like some of our own thoughts and reflections on this, and also understanding the complexities around the terms. But I guess the one thing, like I want to connect to, some of the traditional like Indigenous knowledge that was shared with me, and I've been very fortunate to really have that time and connection through and access through the Friendship Center movement. And one of the things that consistently many of knowledge keepers have shared with me has been, you know, our longest life journey will always be connecting like our mind to our heart. It will be the longest learning journey that we could ever do, because sometimes we either just think with one or the other. And I keep thinking about how a form of identity, and thinking about how lifelong learning is, and how one of the other key messages that I've been reading in the past couple of weeks as well is that there needs to be time to unlearn. So with that being said, like it is really much in ensuring that we're investing in time and building meaningful relationships, as Kathy mentioned, and about that time piece is extremely important. I think, Kathy, without you even knowing it, you know, you even connected to some of the teachings that is brought forward, how relationships take time. I also really want to is who. So
yeah, go ahead.
Thank you.
No
So I think, like, again, like without being too repetitive, I do connect with some of the pieces that Kathy was sharing, but I think it's just there's still a lot of unlearning that needs to happen, and in terms of really connecting that with a form of identity, like how that there's complexities in that because of that lifelong learning. So I kind of like wanted to jump back to I guess question number 2, and how I can encourage folks to really not think about it as an identity, but what can they do to support community. So it's a lot of listening, a lot of learning, being responsible for yourself, and showing up to support, and also too knowing the historical context and the cultural context of what you're supporting, being an ally. But the identity piece, I'm a little bit I'm a little bit hesitant in terms to like agree if it should be considered a form of identity. Miigwech.
Thank you, T. And Ben, anything to add?
Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you to T and Kathy for their points. I've been also thinking a bit about the unlearning, and I think just if I may, connecting both of your points just now is the unlearning is key, and then I would think, and I would try to do myself. And then what are you then replacing the unlearning with, and how critically are you thinking about the places where you want to get the new information to redo the unlearning, and to make sure that you're learning in the right way. I think from my own perspective, I agree with the panelists on this. I don't necessarily think it can be a form of identity, and I don't necessarily think it can be, I think as has been alluded to, a form of identity that is self-identified. I referenced earlier a piece by Indigenous Action Media on problematizing allyship, and I think they mentioned that the term has become an identity disembodied from any mutual understanding of support. The term ally has been rendered ineffective and meaningless because of some of the ways in which we try to self-identify. I'm noticing in the chat there's some questions around posting of quotes, so I'm happy through the anti-racism office to just share my notes, and they can be given afterwards. So I'm really happy to do that.
Thank you. Sounds good.
So I also wanted to bring up something. This is sort of a repetition of what's been said before, but at the amazing session last week on Thursday, Ainania Ayodele had said, and I'm quoting, "They are not my ally until I say they're my ally." And I think that we can talk a little bit about the nuances of what we mean by ally, but I'm going to just uphold Ainania's voice with this, and to say that we can never self-identify as allies, because that's not the goal. I don't think it can ever be the goal, because what happens once we achieve that goal? Do we move on to something else? We've done our social media posting now, what do we do next? So I think that there are a set of principles I think we have to live by, and these are far more sustainable than trying to achieve this goal of becoming an ally. We can't stop. This has to continue for time immemorial. And I think one of the things that Kathy had mentioned is that we need, again, I think I'm just going off what she said around making sure that we continue to do this, and there's no real end to this. It needs to be something that, in terms of our lifelong learning, and we need to incorporate this into our daily practice. I do think it means that we do have to be mindful of the identities that sort of are listed in the beginning of the question. And I think I want to go back to speak a little bit more about, as white folks, knowing what we embody in different spaces and the approaches we need to take as we seek to live out the principles of what we've mentioned before. I sort of, another quote which I will post afterwards, but Robert Terry had said, to be white in America, and I think you can extrapolate this to this context, is to not have to think about it. So we don't have to think about whiteness, but I think we need to start thinking about it and what it brings into different spaces, and interrogating it a lot more than I think we do. I think that means once we're aware of this, we need to figure out how we can use our privilege to make change. Again, not being leaders, but to how we can support these efforts. I'm sure many are aware of a book by Anne Bishop called Becoming an Ally, that she noted that she is one piece in a massive complex system, part of a people in a history, and has some advantages that they can offer. We can take risks with fewer or less serious repercussions. I think that's one of the things I'm noting and thinking about now is, and that's one of the reasons why I'm happy to participate in today, and knowing I'll make mistakes, but I can take risks, and I think I have fewer and lesser repercussions when I do that. But the shape and the struggle does not belong to me, but I can take risks and try to do what I can to support and move the struggle forward. One final thing I wanted to mention in relation to the different identities is allyship and solidarity efforts do need to be accessible from a disability-related perspective, and this is something that Kathy and I talked about with T yesterday, is the notion of who are we envisaging and who are we thinking about when we talk about solidarity, and what are the things and the capabilities that folks have in order to participate. So I think we need to be mindful of the accessibility of it, how and why people participate, and making sure that all of our efforts are accessible to various different kinds of folks. I think one small thing is captions as were provided today. We're going to continue to share resources afterwards, but I think that's one thing I wanted to think about. 3 or 4 pieces that had come to my mind about ways to move forward is, I think it's okay to start small, but I think we need to be constantly asking ourselves, what have we done today? And to constantly renew our commitment to this every single day. So in my context, I'm a father to white kids. So what books am I buying for my kids? What am I noticing about the media that they consume? What am I noticing about the ways in which they talk about this? And we need to be constantly having that conversation, I think, with kids, rather than necessarily being something about talking about it when it hit the news. I think we need to try to address these issues as often as we can. I think we need to consider what we're doing in all areas of our life. And I think this has been mentioned, as long as it's safe for us to do so and we feel supported, we should think about where we bring this issue up with people who are not talking about it. We shouldn't be waiting for the issue to arise. We shouldn't be waiting for people to ask us what we think of something who's never talked about it before. I think we need to be trying to actively pursue the question with people who haven't talked about it. And there are other areas in our different lives. So in our institutions, recognizing I have a lot of power within the institution. What am I doing in that space? What am I bringing to different areas of my life, and how I can address the topic in those areas? And I think being mindful of our identity, we need to think about the different identities we bring into different spaces from my perspective, and what that means in how we act and what we do, being careful in Black community spaces, but also taking a different approach when we're in white only spaces. And I think the final thing I wanted to say is being prepared for the fact that you're going to make mistakes and errors, and have supportive folks around to help out who aren't going to be harmed by the errors that you make, I think is key. And the final one is, if in doubt, donate, which I have the means to do, and I've been doing a lot of that lately, but to the appropriate organizations. Thank you.
Thank you to all three of you. I just want to say to Kathy, T, and Ben, for all your resources and quotes, if you can please sort of list them in the chat so folks can access them at their own leisure. And we're going to move into the Q&A portion. So I'm going to turn this over to Jody to begin.
Yes, hi everyone. Thanks again. You know, I've been paying attention to the chat and wanted to raise one of the conversations as a question for the panelists as it relates to accountability. And so for the person who's been speaking to this in the chat, I really am intrigued by the question or the discussion point that you had raised. I'm not sure if you're comfortable wanting to sort of unmute your microphone and sort of think through your reflection around, or your thoughts around, about accountability versus solidarity. What is more effective for us to be discussing at this time? And what's the relationship between accountability and solidarity? So before I toss it to the panelists, I just want to invite the individual in the chat, if you're comfortable. I'll just give a few seconds to see if you want to engage. Okay, so I'll raise it just as a point for the panelists. We've been talking about allyship and solidarity. Should we be really pushing the conversation on accountability? What's the relationship between the two? Where should we be focusing our dialogue at this time? And I will direct this question first to T.
Miigwech, Jody. Who would have thought the Q&A part is just makes me more nervous than the actual questions? But miigwech to the person who put this forward. I think it's really important, and I'm swaying more towards around focusing on the accountability piece. I think at times, even like in my own self-reflection of hearing the other panelists, and I've also been reviewing the chat as well. And I think in terms of accountability, I'm always going to look to leadership. And that could be leadership in a sense of that might be different to many different people. I could look to my own leadership on my community, but also leadership in terms of like I'm looking to the folks that if we want to talk about that political responsibility and looking to those folks that we're wanting to keep accountable. Those are some of the things that I'm really I'm still continuing to reflect on, and of what happens then if we're not seeing any of that accountability come through. And more importantly, some of the other points that the panelists have brought up as well is we keep coming to this place of the importance of action. So action is absolutely integral in order to address some of these challenges, these not just the challenges, but these like very, very like severe things that we're seeing in our communities right now. Harmful, hurtful, horrendous things. And so I just think it's just something that in terms of the accountability piece, like I personally, I really look to leadership, and more importantly, I look to that action and what's really behind that. Is really, really telling. So I still, you know, I know I'm kind of like bouncing from different places with this particular question, but I'm still reflecting on it because there's still a lot of complexities in kind of like comparing the two, I guess. So I know that's a little bit all over the place, Jody, but I'm still thinking on that. Miigwech.
Well, thank you. And I'm just gonna offer a follow-up opportunity for either Kathy or Ben on that same question around accountability and solidarity and the relationship between the two.
I can speak a little bit to this. I always wonder about questions where it's like, do we talk about this or this? And I think we're talking about both of them today in a lot of ways. And I don't believe that they're disconnected. I think accountability is important for the practicality that it offers right now in us following the money, figuring out where it is, and pushing to hold folks and institutions accountable for creating systems that are replicating these kinds of injustices. And that's really important. But in the work of doing so, we are talking about solidarity, and we are creating solidarity and creating communities and being with each other to amplify this message, these messages, and to think critically about the actions that we are taking together. So I don't think that they're different necessarily, but I do think the focus on accountability is there's something that it offers very practically, and that's deeply, deeply important right now.
Thank you for that. I'm going to offer up another question. So participants, bear with me. There's a lot of engagement in the chat, so I'm trying my best to capture as much as we can within the time frame. And there was a question that I noticed around donations. And in light of all what's happening, and I've had even a few folks reach out to me and say, where can I donate? Where does donations fall in this notion of allyship and allyship and solidarity? Should we be encouraging people to donate to organizations? Is that one of the actions that determines allyship? Where does this notion of just clicking some buttons, sending some funds to an organization, and then going about our daily lives fall within this conversation? I'm going to start this off with Ben.
Okay, thank you. I think I sort of started that with my final recommendation or idea. I think to your point, it's not enough on its own. And I think that to your point, oftentimes that can be an element of performativity in and of itself, in terms of, and also a way of sort of folks assuaging how they're feeling about this. And I think one of the things that comes up a lot in this sort of talk and work around this is not wanting to respond to the issues that we're seeing from a position of guilt. I think that oftentimes leads to us doing the wrong things. And I think that oftentimes donations can sometimes be a direct response to that. Is you feel bad about something, you want to do something, so what's the first thing you do? You donate. I think that it's important for it to not be one of those, not just be that on its own. But I do know that organizations who are trying to push for this, who have had leadership from the racialized group, need support in order to do what they're doing. It's almost impossible. And we also know that folks continue to need support who have been historically marginalized too. So I think that it is an important thing to try to consider to do. It's not enough in and of itself. And I think that we do need to be quite careful in the spaces that we choose to do this and the organizations to which we donate. It's very difficult to sort of, for me to give a list or for me to determine who you should be donating to, but I think it's important to be mindful of the reasons why you're doing it and to think quite critically about why you decided to do this, and then ask yourself, is this enough? Is there any other things I can do in my life, in the locations in which I hold power, or the locations in which I can make change, to do something more than providing resources to groups that need it?
Okay, thank you. So in light of just time frame and wanting to get as much questions as possible, I'm going to move on to another question. We'll probably have space for about 2 to 3 more questions, but we'll try for the 2. Now, this is a big one, so bear with me as I hope I'm capturing the essence of the question appropriately from the chat. And this is one that relates to the role of capitalism. And I found this question to be quite intriguing. You know, where does capitalism, and I don't know if we can talk about capitalism and not talk about colonialism, where does capitalism and colonialism fall within this conversation? You know, as folks are gathered here in wanting to really engage in anti-racist work, in allyship and solidarity work, but within these structures that is very difficult to see and know when they're impacting us, such as the consequences of colonialism and the role capitalism plays in these very conversations that we're having. And so I'm actually going to wait to see if any of the panelists want to volunteer on just sort of reflecting, thinking through and reflecting on this particular question and how it falls for them.
I can start. I think it is all of it. When we're thinking about how, even like where movements come from, like we're in these spaces, these are frameworks that we're thinking about, these are lived like realities. And I think it impacts movements in some ways, and it impacts, like we were just talking about donations, and the limitations of donations are also like similarly limitations of individuals funding what is supposed to be like a social kind of support that should be there from the government. And I think we're thinking about that a lot now, in terms of like looking at how all this money moves into police forces and into the military, whereas the reality to it is like really, it's not just about us giving individual donations, it's us like pushing for the money that's already there to be moving into the right places. And I think capitalism will trick us a lot of the times to kind of individualize these things as if we shouldn't have the right to claim where our money goes, and in a bigger way. So donations are absolutely important, but this is kind of the game of capitalism anyways, and this isn't necessarily a direct comparison. I think this is oversimplistic, but in terms of thinking about charities and why those things are not sustainable, it's because there is a social need, there's a social and economic need, and rather than the government filling those needs through money that's already there that we should be able to determine where it goes, we kind of offset it to folks to like donate to this or that charity, this or that food bank, and individuals are then suddenly like giving to support communities, which is important, but there's something bigger there and there's bigger money there. And I think that's how capitalism is deeply impacted. And I think I also started by saying that it also impacts our movements in ways that we need to be really critical about. I think neoliberalism has us focusing so much on individual perfection, and that is a horrible way to live and a horrible way to build community with each other. And it is not humanizing, and there's nothing about that is sustainable. The politics driven by guilt is not sustainable. It is deeply neoliberal. And I think we need to be not kind to each other. Like, we do need to be kind to each other, absolutely. But we need to recognize humanity, to share humanity. And I think that's what all of this is about. So we can't lose sight of that. And we have to make sure that our movements are not toxic and that we're not driven by guilt. And I think that capitalism easily feeds off of that and like keeps replicating those toxic colonial structures.
So I am going to, thank you, Kathy. I am going to try to squeeze in 2 last questions within 4 minutes. And there is a lot of conversation in the chat happening now around, and to be quite frank, the spark for the protest today is looking at a lot of our major institutional entities, including, oh, hold on, looks like we may have, is everybody muted? Thank you. Including our entities of policing and safety, campus police, local police organizations like Toronto Police. And it's a conversation that we need to include in every aspect of this journey as we continue to navigate more concretely. And so I want to raise this to the panelists around a bit broadly, because we know there's a lot of conversations happening locally in the media, whether it's around defunding, whether it's around terminating relationships as it relates to our policing systems. What would you invite individuals who are on this call to think about as we explore and continue to demand action around our relationships with our policing systems? And so I'm actually going to leave this one, open it up to either Ben and or T to invite a reflection on this one. So whoever unmutes first.
My apologies, Jody. I was having some technical issues and it was muted pretty much that entire time. My apologies. However, so I know I'm probably not answering this right, but given the time, I do just want to take this opportunity just to share that, especially within the Indigenous community specifically, that there has been so much work for a very, very long time in terms of creating commitments, creating final reports through national inquiries. I mean, I could give you so many different examples of, in particular, the Hawthorne Report, which was established in the 1960s, which really forced Canada to look, for the very first time, look in our own backyard based on what are our own issues and challenges around systemic racism and discrimination. And it really came from the civil rights movement out of the states that forced Canada to look on what's going on. The National Inquiry for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, the TRC report, which both of these reports were just commemorated last week, the 5th anniversary of the TRC and the very first anniversary of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. I think what I want to just share, and my apologies again if this is completely disconnected from what you were asking earlier, Jody, but I just want to really encourage community and beyond to not forget that there has been so much work in keeping on this commitment, keeping government, communities, organizations, both provincially and nationally, accountable and continue to be committed. But unfortunately, the reality is that we keep coming to this place of asking a question and perhaps maybe even banging on government's door, asking why nothing has been done. And in what we've been talking about today, when those things happen, and unfortunately they continue to happen, I want to look to the person or people around me, the BIPOC community around me, and community to support me in continuing on banging on doors and continuing on sharing and expressing that things that have already been looked into, or the hard work that has gone into these very integral reports, that they're not forgotten and that there's a commitment that was made. I think those are some of the things that in all of the mess and challenges that we're experiencing, I think those things are forgotten. And I would just really encourage everyone to not forget and to not just look at a report and see a community perhaps that you don't actually belong to, but actually see yourself in that report or in the reports. So I just kind of, I guess some of my final thoughts and reflections are really just encouraging community that's here to be agents of change for everyone, for yourself. So miigwech and bamapi, and my apologies again, Jody, for missing that question.
That's okay. And I think that your reflection is the note within which we would want to end this particular session, as the time is 11:32. So I just want to say thank you to all those who have joined. Thank you to all those sharing resources. Thank you to all those holding, asking critical questions, and for pushing this conversation forward. I invite you to push these conversations forward in your respective workplaces, in the learning environments, within the classrooms. We look forward for you. Hopefully all of you can join us again for a conversation this Thursday. We're talking about racism in the home. How are we having these conversations with our children, with our family members? What are some key lessons that we need to take away to continue being agents of change, as T has just asked us to do? Thank you so very much. We remain available to you. Yes, the session's being recorded. Yes, we'll work on getting the quotes that were shared by our panelists up on a slide, and we'll put that up on our website within the next week. So thank you so very much. Have a great afternoon. Bye, everyone.